There's a problem. And of course, the problem is not with our God. The problem is not with the way that God created us. The problem is the way that we sometimes respond to our God. You might follow along on the handout this morning. There will not be slides as an FYI if you're looking for those. But that first line reminds us that God created us. And in that first blank there, you might put the word worship. 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 That God created us as humanity for worship. To worship, to glorify, to honor. There are several terms you could put in that slot. Let's just say this morning that God created us as humanity to worship our Creator. He created us with this innate desire and longing to worship. And thus that desire, that longing is never fulfilled, never really satisfied until it is lost in a way in worship, until we give ourselves away in worship to our Creator. At the same time, it is true that our God created so many wonderful blessings and gifts. I describe them on the handout as enjoyable gifts, good things in our world. And we enjoy many of those, have enjoyed many of those already today. The blessing of this morning, getting to wake up and enjoy the beautiful morning. Enjoy coming together to worship and encourage one another. Enjoy blessings that we have in the modern world that we think of at least as blessings, like air conditioning. And I know some of you are thinking, I got a little too much of that, too much of a good thing this morning. And I get that. And we enjoy these gifts from God. The problem is that we occasionally, and I'm using that rather loosely this morning, it's probably more than just occasionally, isn't it? We take those enjoyable blessings and those good things that God created for us to enjoy. We take the things that God created to point us back to Him, if anything, and we turn them. We pervert them and abuse them. We misuse them so that we turn them into something more than just good gifts. We turn them into gods. We turn them into our idols. Our hearts create idol after idol. And we begin to worship. We begin to be devoted to something or perhaps someone other than the God who made us. God created us for worship. He gave us enjoyable gifts that show us His goodness and greatness. And yet as humanity, as I even said in my prayer, and as I believe is one of the last lines of the handout, in many ways, the negative issue of humanity, of our lives, is that of idolatry. That's why God gave us the command. The command. So now, look with me at the command or the commands, then the dangers of not following this command, and then in the end, mostly the questions. We'll do more than just ask questions, but a lot of that last line of thought is some self-examining questions. We're going to have to hold up a mirror this morning, and I know that's not comfortable. It never is. It may not be even comfortable for some of us physically, but for sure, from a spiritual standpoint, sometimes asking ourselves some difficult questions, although difficult, is so vital. Let's consider these three together this morning. First, then, the commands. Here we think about rival kings or rival kingdoms. Imagine a king that is the perfect, benevolent, loving, caring, guiding, guarding, all those terms, king. And he rules his kingdom in justice and goodness. But then some messengers come from a different king. And they bring all these treasures. They bring the shiny things, let's say, that their king promises to his subjects. But unbeknownst to this people, this kingdom, the other kings also happen to be tyrants who are only concerned about their power and getting more power and using it to inflict whatever their heart's desire is, comes out usually as abuse and mistreatment to their subjects. So then imagine the good king calls his subjects to him and says, warning, be careful. The other kings of the other kingdoms are not offering what you think they're offering. It is a comparison, so it falls short. But that is somewhat of the picture of the true God versus fake gods. The true king of our hearts versus the allurements and the trinkets of Satan. Let's turn to Deuteronomy together this morning. Deuteronomy chapter 5. Command or the commands. Deuteronomy chapter 5 is mostly, there's more to it than this, but it's mostly a retelling of what we've come to know as the Ten Commandments, or the 10 words, the Decalogue, if you want to get a little fancier this morning. You'll find those back in Exodus chapter 20. Now they're repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Part of why I selected this example of the 10 is because of what follows that we'll get to momentarily in chapter 6. So we get to be a little lazy this morning. We won't have to turn from from Exodus to Deuteronomy. We'll just stay for a couple of passages in Deuteronomy. Hopefully we're not making lazy or convenience our idol this morning. But in Deuteronomy chapter 5, we read about the command. It's first for a reason. I'm not the first to point this out, so I'm going to say it's been observed through the centuries that the first commandment is a priority. If nothing else, because if you break any of the other commands here or elsewhere in the Bible, you've already broken the first one. And sometimes we look at behaviors like stealing or adultery or murder, and those are really symptoms of a deeper problem. They have an idolatry problem behind them. It's when God is not God. It's when something else is either equal or above God. When I'm worshiping and giving myself, giving my heart to something else. And that's why he says, no others. No other gods. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 5. He says in verse 6, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Here's our background. Here's our relationship already. You know what I've done. You know who I am. So, verse 7 says, you shall have no other gods before me. No other gods before me. Not in the sense of don't put any others above me, and don't have any others before me in the sense of in my presence. Before me as in don't have any others at all. No other gods. No rivals. No other gods. And then he follows with this explanation. He says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is on the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them. You might think of that as worship in general, or serve them. You might even think of that as in the way that when I try to control and manipulate things, in a lot of ways that's what ancient idolatry was. Sometimes that's what idolatry is today. I want to be in control. So I create my own God that I can fit and manipulate however I want. And I look at it as the God serving me, right? And it's about ownership. I want to hold this and possess this. But it is always the case that the God I fashion, whether it is an idol that I created of gold or it's something a bit more subtle than that, it always controls me. I always end up serving and being owned and controlled by whatever it is that I make my God. He says, don't worship them, don't serve them. And you're going to do that regardless if you have a fake God. And then he says this, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. You read that right. God, our God, the true and living God, is a jealous God. You will find this statement every time it is used. It's used a few more times in the Hebrew text. Every time God describes himself as jealous, it is in the context of idolatry. It is God who does not share his glory with anyone, the God who does not throne share. Even the throne of my heart, he does not share his throne with anything or anybody. You'll also find this phrase used with this related phrase, consuming fire. You'll also find that the word for jealous, there's a reason even in English we spell it almost like the word zealous. It pictures God as a God who is jealous or is consuming zealously for us and the loyalty of our hearts. What would it be like if God wasn't jealous? If he was the king, and when the rival kings send their messengers, he's indifferent. Or he suggestingly says, yeah, I suggest you not do that. Or he's just fine with it. You want to worship me and have your heart satisfied? Great. If you want to become the slave of Satan and darkness and end up miserable, okay. What if that worked in other relationships? What if a husband didn't care if his wife entertained the affections of other men, or vice versa? Realize there is a healthy jealousy even in human relationships. When there's a relationship that is designed to be a soul kind of devoted loyalty, where there are no rivals, there are no competitors, there are none. No other gods. God says, you don't do that because I'm jealous for your loyalty and affections. And then he goes on to describe more of his character here with a balance of, yes, love and kindness and covenant loyalty, but also of justice and judgment. A God who says, I am your God. Don't have any other gods. Depending on how you count it, it is possible that the marriage relationship, as an analogy, that God as our husband, we as his wife in that sense, that analogy is used more than any other analogy, any other way of describing our relationship to God from cover to cover in the Scriptures. And part of that seems to be because of God's zealous, jealous approach to us, and because of how prevalent the problem of idolatry is. It's not just an issue. It's the issue of our lives. It is found in some form. It is addressed in some way in every document, every book in this we call the Bible. Again, from cover to cover. Over 50 laws from Genesis to Deuteronomy alone are specifically about idolatry. It is one of the few sins, if you want to call it a sin. I mean, it's the basis of all other sins. So, I mean, it is a sin, but it's more than just a sin. But it is one of the few, let's say, crimes under the old law that were capital crimes. It is no small deal to God. It is the first commandment God gave them for good reason. Then you might flip a page or so to the next chapter as we have it in Deuteronomy chapter 6. The other first commandment. And here, if you're filling it out, I believe the word there is one. One God that we love. Jesus, when asked about the greatest command, gave two, first and second. The first one, he doesn't go to have no other gods before me. he goes to Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5. Could it be that this is like the positive side of the other first command? What if the answer, the solution to the problem of what I do with the good gifts God has given me and how God created me to worship Him, what if the solution is learning and developing a total, all-encompassing love for God? Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And this is in a context of polytheism and dualism. There's a multiplicity of gods. You pick one or two or all of them, or there are two, good and evil, that are in this dualistic battle. In a world where we are told about so many different ideas and philosophies, and they're all on equal standing. All opinions, all ideas about God and the world are equal. Our God still says, "Hear, the Lord our God is one." And then he says, verse 5, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." Isn't that the answer? A devotion that says whatever it is, and a devotion that is not separated and dissected, where I give part of myself to God and part of myself to something else. And we like to compartmentalize, don't we? And so we go to church on Sunday morning, and that's God part of our life. We might even go on Sunday evening and Wednesday night, and then we're really, really involved and active religiously. Loving God with all that I am. Here's something that a man wrote to his fiancée. This is about, I guess, 7 decades ago or so now. So that kind of gives you some political context, maybe. And some of you were thinking, well, that was a long time ago for me, and me too. But it's a young man who has been captured by the communist philosophy. And so he's writing back to his fiancée, for one thing, breaking up with her. Here's part of what he says. It's a lengthy letter, and I'm not going to read it all to you, but here's the part that really stands out. He said, there is one thing that I am in dead earnest about, and that is the cause. In my life, my business, my religion, my hobby, my sweetheart, my wife, my mistress, and my bread and my meat. It gets a little poetic. I work at it daytime and dream of it at night. Its hold on me grows, not lessens as time goes on. Therefore, I cannot carry on a friendship, a love affair, or even a conversation without reading it to this force, which both drives me and guides my life. I evaluate people, books, ideas, and actions according to how they affect the communist cause and by their attitude toward it. I've already been in jail because of my ideals, and if necessary, I'm ready to go before a firing squad. Now, clearly, there's going to be some distinction here, and the lesson is not to break up with your fiancé or your wife or to tell your kids, I'm sorry. But there's something there, isn't there? About having one thing that drives you like nothing else does. One thing that becomes the center hub, and then everything else are like the spokes of that wheel, that everything else is related to that. You see everything through that viewpoint. Now, obviously the object of that is not the goal here. But what if that kind of attitude, that kind of devotion and dedication, what if that was how I loved God? The commands this morning. No other gods. Love God with everything you are. Now let's back up and consider the dangers. We've already considered them in one sense, but let's focus on them for a moment. The dangers. Have you ever made a bad trade? I think about the little boy that didn't realize what he had, and he traded, in a sense, his baseball card for $3. Not realizing until years later that that specific card was worth a whole lot more than $3. More like $3 million. Ever made a bad trade? Part of what we do when we fall into the trap of idolatry is that we make a trade. We trade the glory of God for something far less glorious. I'm mindful this morning of the psalmist in Psalm 106, 19 and 20. He's looking back on a time when God was telling his people with those words, no other gods, and they made the golden calf, as we now have termed it. The psalmist says they traded the glory of God for a bull made out of gold, like a bull that eats grass. You think about that, right? God is himself giving the law to Moses. They've seen the fire. They've heard the thunder. They were afraid of it. And while Moses is up receiving the law, they make their own God. Was it easier to worship a grass-eating bull, and not even a real bull, a statue of one? I don't know. And we look at that and think, how could they do that? But then we look at ourselves. And we see where we trade the glory of God, the value and treasure that we have, for a few minutes of pleasure, for a little more in our bank account. Turn with me to Romans chapter 1. Let's read a portion of Romans chapter 1. As we think about this trade or exchange it's made. It's a lot like when you travel between countries and you feel like something was lost. You left something behind. I don't know that the exchange was quite right, but more so. Romans chapter 1. Begin with me now at verse 21. He says, although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give him thanks. Honor, gratitude. They're two opposites of idolatry. And so they became futile in their thinking. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And look at it. And exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. And although the focus at this point is still on the ancient forms of idolatry that were predominantly the very visual, obvious ones, the fact that he included statues or gods that were made to look like men or humans is a cue, a reminder that one of, if not in some ways, the ultimate God that we worship, other than God himself, is the God, little g, of self. And we start tracing the symptoms. Why am I so short-tempered with my kids? Why am I so angry when I lose? When somebody cuts me off on the road? When I have to stand in line? And it just could be that the idol behind that in the depths of my heart is just me. So. But you trace Romans chapter 1. You read 24 through 32. And you quickly realize, if you didn't already, that this is not just about what I do when I bow down to an idol god. That when my heart is given to something other than God, when I fall into idolatry, then the door is opened. Just like you break any of the 10 commandments, you break the first one automatically. Here, idolatry in the heart leads to sexual perversion, a clear description here of what we call now homosexuality and lesbianism, and now we've got even more that we've created in our culture, although really nothing is new. And then he just lists That last paragraph is just a full list of all of the sins and practices that take good things and pervert them. All because, he says, they did not honor and give thanks to God. All because they fashioned God to their liking, not the reality. So God gives them up, as it says, to all of these practices, and even approving of them. When you get to verse 32, we make a trade. Then right on the heels of that is a loss. That's your key word there, a loss, L-O-S-S, loss of awareness. When we worship idols, it does something to our minds. We said earlier we become enslaved. And part of that enslavement is that we lose our mental awareness. I have down Isaiah 44, 18 and 19. It's a couple of verses from a passage where Isaiah is, in a way, laughing at how ridiculous idolatry is. There, where man takes a piece of wood and, in a way, he splits it. He uses one piece to warm himself and cook his dinner, and the other piece he coats with precious metal and bows down to as his God. And Isaiah says it doesn't somehow dawn on him. He doesn't realize how crazy that is. He doesn't realize what he's doing at all. And again, this is where we join with Isaiah in laughing at how crazy that is. Why would you do that? I wonder if they might look at us. And they might see us bowing down to a screen with a bunch of LEDs. Or they might see us serving and slaving our lives away in an addiction, busyness, slaving our lives away at our jobs. And it might not be that our idol is work. It might be our idol is money or prestige, the next promotion we're chasing with everything we have. Or the fact that most of what we consider as valuable today is some words printed on paper. They might look at us and say, don't you realize what you're doing? What you're doing to yourself? I mean, we don't have a problem with consumption of food today. We've got more access to more food than ever as a society. And yet we've created a host of problems by what and how much we eat. We don't have any financial problems, do we? And yet, as statistics go, everybody in this room is rich. And yet the richest among us are those that are caught in legal problems, mental health issues, and more. We mentioned last Sunday the sexual revolution. We don't have a problem in our culture, do we, with relationships and dysfunctional families and STDs? And you might wonder if we might look at ourselves and go, what are we doing? And then the third thing that happens as idolatry takes over is a constant longing for more. Take a glance at Ecclesiastes 5 with me. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 10 and 11. Look at how Solomon describes the never enough mentality. Now here, he's specifically looking at money, but it applies to far more than just money. We found the thing that is our heart's desire. And it might be a hobby. It might be a possession, something we're going to enjoy. And before we know it, we're either moving on to something else or we've got to have more. And it's the reason, for example, that those that are addicted to pornography, which is a lot of people in our culture, in our churches even, it gets, you have to find something. People get deeper and deeper into more perverse and more perverse images. Why? Because idols do not satisfy. Here's an example from Ecclesiastes 10 and 11. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eye? There is a constant longing for more and more. Now here's where the difference is. When God is my devotion, when God is what fills my heart, I'm satisfied. Now, that does not mean I walk away and, okay, I've got that part taken care of. I don't need any more of God. It's almost a paradox that, yes, I still want more of God, but the longing, the brokenness is gone. We have someone in our congregation who sold their airplane because they concluded it had become their idol. These are some of the dangers we face, and sometimes we face them. Sometimes we wake up and say, no more, because they've traded the glory of God. We've lost our mental acuity, and we always have to have more. The commands are there because of the dangers of idolatry. Now, as we conclude this morning, you might consider those three passages. They're three examples: Colossians 3:5, Matthew 6:24, and Philippians 3:18 and 19. They're three examples of when you come to the New Testament of how already in their day the focus has began to shift to the more subtle idols. If you survey the history of Israel, they always struggled with idolatry. It was the issue in reality. It's hard to pick a time in ancient Israel where they weren't struggling with idols from the king down. And they eventually are carried into exile, and if you had to pick the reason God sends them to Babylon, it's because of idolatry. And it's like it broke something in them as a people. When they come back 7 decades later to the homeland, they never again struggled with idolatry, or did they? They never bowed down to Baal. They never took their children to Molech ever again. They didn't even adopt the Greek and Roman gods. Their gods just became more difficult to see. And so Colossians 3 is the God of greed, possibly of everything listed there, of sexual immorality and more. The least of covetousness. Gotta have more. The God, the slave we become to the God of possessions in Matthew 6. And the God of our stomach, which is about more than just food, but that'd be included in Philippians chapter 3. So some questions. And that last line there is the anatomy of idolatry. What if we just looked at that mirror? And I may get these in the wrong order, and I may miss them, and so we'll look at these questions as they come out of my mouth this morning. But I think about my mind. Think about your mind. We have things we obsess about, don't we? I mean, some of us more than others, but there's negative obsessive thoughts. We worry and get anxious about something. Then we even have positive obsessive thoughts, and you might think of that more as the daydreaming that we do. What is it that let's just say I this morning, and you ask it with me, what is it that I go to in my mind? Either I obsess about negatively or positively. What is it? When I don't have something else, I'm forced to think about, where does my mind go? And then my heart. And I know we're not really talking about the organ, but if you want to help a visual this morning, you might put your hand or point at your heart anatomy. What about my emotions? What is it that really angers me? Is it when somebody insults me? Is it, or is it when somebody insults God? What is it that gets me so upset and bothered? Or on the other hand, what is it that makes me the happiest? What gets me excited? Is it when my sports team wins? Or is it spending time with God's people? And I'm not saying you can't be excited about both. They're just some questions. Or then while I'm thinking about it, to make sure I don't miss this, what about the watch? That's the missing question there, the watch. Some of us still wear the old-timey. I just recently started wearing this one. I inherited it from my father-in-law, and so it's a little sentimental. Most of us now have Apple Watches or some type of electronic digital watch, and they track everything about us. I heard a preacher a couple of weeks ago. His watch went off during the message, and it said, "It looks like you've taken a major fall." Well, he was still standing, but somehow he gestured or hit his hand as he preached, and his phone thought he had fallen. The question then is, what does my watch tell me? Not that you've fallen during a sermon. I'm thinking more old school here. How do I spend my time? If my watch could talk, if we still use our watches to keep time, and I know we use our phones more than anything, what would it tell me? So then go to my phone. How about that one? What would my phone tell me? If a phone could talk, and I know they do, but you know what I mean, and they do tell us how much time we spend, what would my search history show? That I might have deleted, but what would that show? And I'm not just talking about the stuff we think of as wrong. There's neutral things. And isn't that idolatry often is when we take a good thing that God's given us, as we said, and we make it into an ultimate thing? By the way, the top 3 searches on Google are in this order: YouTube, Facebook, and I just forgot the third one, so you're going to have to ask me later. But not that it's anything wrong with those. I use YouTube. We put our sermons on YouTube. We put good things on Facebook. It's just a question. What am I spending my time on? Or my lips? I think that's the last question, isn't it? Is there one thing that I talk about more than anything else? Or is there one thing I complain about more than anything else? Now, ironically, we are the entertained culture. We've got more access and more ways to entertain ourselves to death than perhaps any other culture, at least in recent times. But did you know one of, if not the predominant complaint across our society is boredom? And there are things we have told ourselves can't be our idols. Go back to that mental awareness. Could my family ever become an idol? Could my religious deeds be an idol? It's possible. Now hold on to your seat. Is it possible that politics and government and even my country, and I mean this country, not our heavenly citizenship, could that ever become something I'm so obsessed about and devoted to that it becomes my God? Just some questions this morning. We've seen the commands. We've seen the dangers those commands are intended to prevent us from. And we've asked some questions from head to toe, as it were. And so now comes the time, at the end of the sermon, near the end of the service, where we say, invitation. Invitation. And it's a way that we've put together to provide a specific occasion where we sing to one another for our God to say, is your heart right with God? I didn't look at the invitation song, so I'm not trying to quote it. But the time when we ask each other, where's my heart? Where's my heart? If there's something this morning, if that something is becoming a child of God, leaving the slavery of sin, becoming one with Jesus, why not this morning? Don't let this opportunity pass. As a Christian, why not this morning? We even use the phrase rededicate. It's kind of an older phrase. What if today was the day I left this church building rededicated to my God? Before we do that, I've got to share this with you. It's about little Janie. Young girl, loves her parents so much. And one day her dad calls little Janie to him and he gives her a set of pearls. They're not real pearls, they're artificial. Janie, to her, that's not even a question. She loves them and wears them every day. Doesn't matter the attire, she's wearing her pearls. She keeps them in a special place in her room. She cleans them. They are the prettiest, best thing she's ever had. And time passes. And she grows a little more attached to her pearls each week, each month. Until one day, Dad calls little Janie. He says, I need you to do something for me. It's not going to be easy. I need you to give me your pearls back. And you're never going to have them back. I'm going to put them in this little box. They came in. I'm going to put them in the drawer in my room. You're never going to see your pearls again. But I've got something even better for you. So little Janie gives her pearls back to Daddy. And he puts them in the box to never be seen again. Then he opens up a different box. And he pulls out a beautiful set. I don't have two sets. So you have to imagine, okay? But he pulls out a beautiful set of the real deal pearls. And gives those to Janie. As he says, I had something better all along for you. God's given us many good gifts, but the best gift is the gift of himself. He says today, enjoy the good gifts, but be careful, because I had something better for you all along. As we stand and sing together.